Welcome to the Talkback Wednesday talk show project of the MCM Youth Media Academy. Each Wednesday, we welcome guests who help us learn more about an aspect of the media as we work on our media project.
Let's welcome our first guest, Brian Anthony. Brian Anthony Smith was born in Washington, D.C. Brian earned degrees from Prince George's Community College, the University of Maryland University College in Communication Studies, Master of Arts degree in Communication, producing for film, television, and video production from American University. Brian has worked on the following productions: I on One with Corey George, The Veronica Harris Show, We Speak, Simply Speaking, and Don't Forget the Desert, and produced the production Be Light. He also produced a talk show, United Kings DMV, and a documentary, Till Victory is Won for DCTV. Till Victory is Won was officially selected to be featured in the International Docuthon Documentary Film Marathon.
Let's welcome our next guest, Larisha Warner. Larisha Warner is a native of Prince George's County. She's an author of books, The Journey to Freedom, Healing and Wholeness. Her life journey has endured countless hundreds, including overcoming childhood sexual trauma. As a result, she used her pain to inspire others to become the best version of themselves.
Our last guest is Dr. Khadijah Z Ali Coleman. She is a committed homeschooling mother and enthusiastic co-founder of Black Family Homeschool Educators and Scholars. She is a multidisciplinary artist and founder of the arts company Liberated Muse Arts Group. A playwright, she has had more than a dozen of her plays presented publicly in venues throughout the country, including the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, Theater Alliance, and Baltimore Theater Project. She is host of the podcast Contemporary Perspectives on Black Homeschooling.
First question is, what inspired y'all to do broadcasting? Like, why did you guys want us to do it?
So I will start. I actually looked at podcasting as being just a wonderful way to stay relevant in the social media world. A lot of the work that I do is forward facing, which means that it's really important to make connections with folks and to build a platform where, I publish books, I have programs that I have. So in order for folks to know about the work that I do, I have to be out there among the people and have ways to get information to people that's just not written on my website. And so a podcast allows me to interview different people who are in my field, who may have an audience themselves, that then they're attracted to see the podcast that I'm hosting. But also folks who may be on YouTube or maybe on Spotify and scrolling and they see a keyword that's in the title of my podcast and say, let me listen to that. And it's just another way to attract people to my brand and to the work that I do. So podcasting was just really a natural evolution to me being active on many online spaces, whether it's Instagram or Facebook. Now, podcasting really allows that connectivity to an audience.
Okay, I guess I can go next.
Yeah.
So what inspired me, actually, my co-host had reached out to me and said, hey, Larisha, we're always talking, we're always communicating. Let's take our intimate conversations and let's put it before people. Let's let them hear our perspective about everyday life. We're millennials, we've gone through so many different experiences. We wanted to make sure that we created like a space where we can be our authentic self. So we've been doing this, I would say, for the last year and a half now, and we have seen the tremendous growth because we were both introverts, of course, we still are. But in that first episode, I remember that first episode where we sounded like we were so lost, we were so nervous, but we actually found our voice in using podcasts. And I think that helped us both individually as women being speakers and entrepreneurs, but it really created the space to let us know, hey, we have something that we can contribute to society. We can encourage other people to know that they can aspire to do whatever it is that they desire to do. So we've been doing this thing for a while now, and it's, I think, one of the best decisions I've ever made, and just being able to create a space where I can just be myself, and you all can actually hear my thoughts about everyday life. So yeah.
I guess it's my turn. So I got into podcasting as a fan. I love listening to podcasts. My favorite ones to listen to are the Directors Guild, Indie Film Hustle, The Read, Plant Proof. I normally listen to things around my interests. So for me, that's diet and that's filmmaking and anything pop culture centric. So I'm a filmmaker and I wanted to find a way to network and to connect with other filmmakers and film fans while also building my own platform. So what I did at the beginning of 2020, before I knew wasn't expecting the pandemic or anything to happen, I had the idea to start a podcast. And it so happened that as I was starting my podcast, a group of friends asked me to be a part of their podcast. So as of today, I'm a part of 2 podcasts. And my podcast specifically deals with filmmaking, talking to other filmmakers about their projects and what inspires them. And then also talking to film fans. There's some funny stories on my podcast as well, with me and my friends, and just experiences we've had watching movies together or going to the movies. So yeah, I did it as a means to network. I wanted to practice getting my own personality out there and figuring out what that is. And just trying to, be comfortable. I'm an introvert, admittedly. So I normally run away from people, but I'm trying to grow from that, and doing the podcast has helped me to just be a little bit more open and share my art and talk about my films and just all things entertainment. So
Our next question is, how long does it take to create a podcast and edit everything?
So you hear me laughing, Nimrita, because just as I'm sure that you've experienced as being a media maker, making your films and all the things that you've made thus far, I'm sure that you know that no one experience is the same. And so there's so many variables that impact how long that post-production time is going to be. I have set out to do interviews that I have every intention for it to be 15 to 20 minutes, because I believe that when it comes to podcasts, the shorter the better if it's like really rich discussion. But you can have a really rich discussion that can go on. And I have set up time to be 15 minutes and wind up with an hour's worth of content that I then have to edit into to pieces. So you have like a part 1, a part 2, because still I want my audience to stick around. So I don't want the content to be where they can't walk away or pause and do something else and then come back to it. And so all of that impacts how long it's going to take to edit it. You might have, I will say, to the first question that Isiah asked about how you got into it, I would say for the current podcast that I have, Contemporary Perspectives on Black Homeschooling, that came about because my organization has an annual event called a virtual teach-in. And we started last year because of COVID virtually, and all of the speaker sessions and the talks that folks had, I wanted that content to still exist and be available for folks to listen to. And so that's how we developed the podcast, because it really became an archive for all of this content. And so that's an example where I'm telling you, Nimrita, where I interviewed, and so all of the interviews took place on Zoom. And I would have folks who would be in another state or country, and then the Zoom would freeze up. We'd be having this really great conversation. The Zoom would freeze up, and it'd be like, oh, So when it came to editing, I would have to go through the entire interview and pick out those spaces where it was frozen and edit it in a way that did not disrupt the continuity and the content, so that it was jolting to the listener. So that took a lot of time. Whereas I had really easy interviews with folks that didn't have disruptions in their Wi-Fi, and they were really short and sweet and concise. And I could literally edit them within 20 minutes, because it wasn't anything that I really had to look for. So one of the things is challenging for me is that I'm the host, I'm the producer, and I'm the editor. So all of that, but it makes being the writer, the producer, and the host makes editing a little bit easier, because then in that post-production period, I know what to look for, and it makes it so I don't have to communicate that to someone else. So that's my long story that I tried to make as concise as possible, but I hope that gives you some insight as to what the possibilities can be.
All right. So with my podcast with my co-host, we have the Journey Heart to Heart podcast. And I personally do not edit the post-production of our podcast, but what me and my co-hosts have come to understand is, for us, we just try to make it as organic as possible. When we used to think about things too much, then that's when we'll fumble, make mistakes. So when we just have our organic conversations, at most we would probably go from anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes at max. And of course, with this whole pandemic, we used to meet in person and do our interviews together. But then we, of course, started using the Zoom platform to record. And we've noticed that, it actually kind of helps us a lot when we can stop and pause and make those quick fixes right in the middle of the conversation. But I think on average, it probably has taken us maybe no more than 35 to 45 minutes, because we kind of got a nice groove going and working together and conversating with each other. We didn't have too many hiccups along the way, but in the beginning, we did learn that this process was a little bit more difficult than we thought it was. But then we just did a lot of research. With us, we try to work smarter, not harder. So I'll be able to explain a little bit later about that terminology and how we try to grow the podcast. For us, we're actually doing something now where we want to educate people on how that you can start a podcast in less than 30 days for less than $150. So that's something that we personally did with our podcast, and we've seen great success thus far.
So with me, it is an adventure, editing and producing my podcast for two reasons. One, I'm on two different podcasts, and I'm on air talent on both, and I am the videographer, editor for those podcasts. The other reason is that because I am not a planner by nature, most of my ideas are very impromptu. So that means that I have to do a better job at planning things out. And that's probably the harder part of my job. The technical side is pretty easy because that's what I like to do. I like editing. I like sound. I'm getting more into sound. But it's the producing part that tends to be a little bit more challenging. So to answer your question, I can navigate a podcast within a week's time, depending on what's going on the show.
Our last question is, what tips do you have for future broadcast makers?
Have fun. Have fun. If you do not have fun, your audience is going to hear it as they're listening to the episodes. So as long as you're laughing, you're into it, and just really just owning the moment, forget the nervousness, forget the fears, your audience are going to be drawn to you. And that's what I've had to learn personally. Just be yourself. When you're yourself, you're going to find that audience who's going to be attracted to your voice, your podcast. And next thing you know, you would have inspired the masses of people. So just be yourself, enjoy the journey, stay consistent with it. That's another thing I had to learn was as you're being consistent with it, you'll get more excited about it. For some people, you may not see the traction or the positive feedback right away, but just know that someone is watching you. So keep going, keep going.
That's excellent advice. I don't really have too much to add, except for I would say that I think podcasting is probably one of the easiest ways for a new media maker to really get a sense of what experimenting with storytelling and experimenting with planning and all the things that Larisha has mentioned. I think that the consistency piece is so important. And I love that she mentioned that because, and I like to say this to my students, I say this to my daughter, I say this to everyone, what we do repeatedly becomes a behavior. And so even if what you start out where you may have mistakes and, no one really starts anything perfectly, but podcasting, I feel, allows for you to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. And there are moving parts, but you don't have to be as meticulous as you do with videography or with a filmmaker. The audio is important, but I feel that the skills in podcasting, from the post-production where you're developing whatever it is that you want to do, whether it's a script, whether you're going to interview, or even just be the only guest and you're doing storytelling, that level of pre-production and then recording and then post-production begins to develop a set of skills that I think are transferable to other media genres. And I think that is just such I would recommend it for anyone to get their feet wet. I love how Larisha and Brian are saying, as introverts, they found that this is a safe space for them to still be forward facing and be able to create something that's shared with the public. And so my tip is to start and keep going. Ask for help. YouTube is such a rich resource for anything you can imagine, podcasting, anything you can imagine. But if you are doing anything like the academy that you all are in, one of the benefits of creating in a group or where you have to share with other people is the peer review and the ability to get feedback. And I think that that's something all media makers can benefit from, is seeking feedback. You don't have to accept everything that you don't have to own everything that people say about your arts, but you want to hear, you want to get feedback because that helps you get better.
Yeah, I think the biggest advice I can give is don't try to sound like anyone else. Everyone has a podcast now, right? So, it's so easy to listen to this podcast and try to take on this personality, or to try to create something that's not authentically you. So if you listen to my podcast, it's been definitely an organic experience. I don't feel like I, have to put on a mask anymore, but I can just say, hey, this is Brian. So when I'm on my podcast, I feel a little bit more relaxed because that's my bread and butter. It's film. So that fixes itself. When I'm co-hosting on the other podcast, that's a little challenging because the other castmates on the podcast, I'm on 2 podcasts. So my podcast is called the B Signal Podcast. I should have said that earlier. I'm sorry. And the other podcast that I'm on is called the Brodies. So on the Brodies, that's a little bit more pop culture, hip hop, rap, da 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 da. I am definitely pop culture, but if you try to make me rap or talk about anything hip hop, I will not only embarrass myself, but I will probably embarrass everything connected to me. Is very funny, and I would not force you to watch anything that I do as it relates to rap. But I use it as an opportunity to let myself shine in my most authentic self and to learn. So there are times where I use that as a means to educate and to show people that, hey, even though that this is what's going on, it's okay to be you no matter what setting you're in. So that's the biggest lesson I learned. Also, as far as tech is concerned, what I appreciate now is that you can produce a podcast and you don't have to break the bank to do it. If you have a cell phone, truthfully speaking, you can make a podcast. So don't let the excuse of technology or equipment be the reason for you not to do it. In fact, the less you have to work with, in my experience, the easier it is to manage. So when I first started out, I bought soundboards, microphones, DAs, all this crazy stuff. And, I grew probably 5 gray hairs prematurely because I stressed myself out about it. But it was horrible in the first part. And then, I had to reset, make things a little bit simple. And so now when I do it, I have a little rhythm going on. So you don't have to get the bells and whistles. And I think that's just a lesson with media, period. Start with what you have. You know, if you want to do podcasts, use that microphone on Apple until you're able to get what you need, and use GarageBand until you're able to get something better. You know, strive for better, but until better happens, don't let that be a reason for you to stop. And then also, don't be afraid to make changes. So when I first started my podcast, each episode, don't laugh at me, other podcasters, they were like 2 hours long, and it was it was like a long drawn out conversation. And so I looked at my analytics and I was like, okay, well, people are making it about 5 minutes in and then they're checking out. So what can I do to either make it so that if they check out early, that at least they'll get the meat of what we're talking about. So this season, this is year 2. I switched it around. So I made it a rule that I'm not going to go past 45 minutes. 45 minutes is the longest I'm going to talk, unless it's something extremely good. So far that's been working for me, and I've noticed that my numbers have been better, and I tend to enjoy the conversation a little bit more that way versus trying to fill out a long, I don't even like talking, as I said previously. So again, going back to being true to yourself, why would you do something that's not authentically you? You know, work within the realm of your personality. And like Larisha said, have fun. If you're not having fun doing it, then it's going to be a chore, and you're going to feel like you're doing homework or you know, whatever it is that you know you have to do but you really don't want to do. So if you're having fun doing it, then whatever time you're going to record, it's going to bring a smile to your face.
We have one last question. How do you find a topic for your podcast?
Well, I can't speak for Larisha and Brian, but my podcast has a theme. So it's called Contemporary Perspectives on Black Homeschooling, so that listeners know that anything that when they come to listen to this podcast, it has something to do with that topic. And so, as I had said before, a lot of the content, the early content came from our teaching. So all the speakers were homeschooling parents or researchers on Black homeschooling. And so moving forward from there, I would reach out to, like earlier this year, I read this incredible editorial on education and found out that the writer was a 17-year-old who had been enrolled in a very well-known private school in New York, Stuyvesant. And he started writing all of these things about his experience there, but asked his parents, could he be homeschooled, because he wanted to have a self-directed learning experience. And he wrote about this. And so I reached out to him and asked him, could he be on my podcast? So a lot of my guests are folks that I've read about, or I've seen, or I've seen their work. And so I've made contact with them by saying, you know, I'm the host of such, co-founder of this organization. I would love for you to be on our podcast, So I've reached out to folks, but I've also reached out to folks that I already know. I know the things that they're doing. And so I do try to make a schedule of of folks I'm going to reach out to, and when I want, because I want to have a season and just have a good bit of content, so that I usually record it at once. Like when I say at once, like within the month or maybe even a week, so that I can spread it out throughout the year. And so that I'm not really dependent on, it's that week I have to interview someone. I have this content and then I can release it at leisure. So that is kind of a little bit into my process, because it allows me to be able to do many things, and podcasting doesn't monopolize the majority of my time.
I think to go along with that, first of all, I'm going to hire Khadijah to coach me on being more organized, because skills. But I know for me, it's easier to come up with topics with co-host. So with the Brodies, that's extremely easy. It's like, what do you guys want to talk about? You know, and if it's geared around a certain topic, like Khadijah said, so for us, it's pop culture. So what's happening in entertainment that everyone's talking about, or what's trending? That's the easier one. For my podcast, for filmmaking, it varies because sometimes it's guest driven. But on the weeks where I'm not able to secure guests, I've been blessed this year to get good guests. So hopefully that'll keep going for me. But on the times where I haven't been able to get guests, I had to be a little bit creative. So what I did was I say, hey, I'll embarrass myself and have my friends come on and just talk about what it's like going to the movies with me. So for example, there's a episode where we talk about my best friend and how she beat me up at the movie theater because I took her to a scary movie and she didn't know that it was scary. And, you know, she really beat me up real bad. It sounds horrible, but it really is funny. And that was kind of into the genesis of our friendship. I have one where, you know, I went to the movies with my brother and a lady literally screamed the entire movie. No, the entire movie. And nothing happened on screen. And it was just horrible. But that brings variety to my podcast. So again, knowing what your niche is, what your goal is, that'll always be a good anchor for you to pull from as far as really identifying what the topics are going to be. I also want to encourage you to do your research, especially if you're aiming to do something political or within education. I think, not to get preachy or to be on a soapbox, but it's very important that if you're going to have a platform, that you try to be as responsible with it as possible. And so, you know, if you're going to talk about education, if you're going to talk about, you know, politics, at least if you're not going to know everything, have someone on the show that can speak to certain issues because you are informing an audience. So, you know, whatever your political whatevers are, you know, just make sure that you have as much information as possible and it's not biased in any way. So yeah, those are how I figure out my topics.
All right. Well, you all said some great things that I do already. But just to add to the conversation, a lot of times my co-hosts and I will actually just having some everyday chatting, talking, and we say, oh, that would be a really good topic to kind of bring to the podcast. So a lot of times it's really the issues that we've gone through in life that we've either overcome or going through now. And we just wanted to create a safe space just to have some real candid conversation. Now, when we invite guests, it's typically people that we either have met along the way on our journeys and we figured they would be good people to interview on the podcast, or even ones that I personally have found on social media who I think will be amazing additions to having really conversations about, you know, life, dating, relationships, finances, entrepreneurship, you name it. We've talked about a lot of great things on the podcast. So we typically are staying, again, authentic to ourselves. If there's something that's more pop culture driven, we'll maybe add a point in it, but we won't spend a whole conversation about it. But we really try to stay authentic to who we are and making sure that we're reaching the people that we're supposed to reach. But well, like I said before, we try to have fun with our topics, things that we do not understand or feel that comfortable talking about. Then we'll bring a guest on and we'll interview them and they can delve in deeper to talk about those more sensitive topics. But that's all I have.
Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you for joining us today, and I want to thank each of our speakers for sharing their experiences with us. We'll see you next time on Talk Back Wednesday. Take care.